Okay, I think we're going to start. Welcome to Enhancing Services to Preserve New Forms of Scholarship. I'm Jonathan Greenberg from NYU Libraries and NYU Press. And before we start, I want to remind everyone to silence your devices. Can everybody hear me okay? We don't have any a microphone or anything in this room, but we'll try to project. We're going to talk about a project that is being led by NYU Libraries to explore the digital preservation of new forms of scholarship that are being produced by university presses. So those are things. Let's see. Well, we'll get to the definition in a moment. But this is a project that is being funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and it is a collaboration between libraries, digital preservation service providers, and publishers. So you can see here are the current sort of main participants in the project. The goals are twofold. We are going to take works that have been, that we anticipate challenges with preserving, and run them through processes with Portico and clocks to develop at least an idea of the best way to preserve those works at scale. So what that means might vary from work to work. Some of the more complex works will take more effort, and so what at scale means for those will be different for the less complex works. The second goal of the project is based on the results of running those publications through these processes with Portico and clocks. We're going to develop guidelines for publishers and authors on the best ways to anticipate these problems. So if a publisher is thinking about publishing an enhanced monograph or a more complex interactive scholarly work, what things can they do at the outset to mitigate the challenges of preserving that work in the long term? Are there particular formats they can use? Or is there particular metadata that they should be recording? Are there things that they should discourage authors from doing because they simply are too risky from a preservation standpoint? Those are the kinds of questions that we will be trying to answer in the report. And we, for this particular project, we have narrowed the scope to things that are monograph-like. So books and projects that see themselves as digital monographs in some way. We recognize that the challenges with other formats, such as journals, are probably really similar, and maybe down the road we would address those as well. But our hope is by dealing with these digital monographs, we will answer some questions that will apply more broadly to journals, to digital humanities projects, to other kinds of digital artifacts. So how we're defining new forms of scholarship. New forms of scholarship are generally works that push the boundaries of how scholars communicate and publishers publish. They include dynamic features, and here's some of the things we're seeing in these works. By the way, the slides will be made available, so you're welcome to take pictures, but we'll also have we'll be circulating a hard copy of the slides. Nonlinear navigation, data visualizations, interactive maps, supporting software, annotations, highlights. These are potential things that we might want to look into the viability of preservation for. And these are all works that are created using flexible formats such as EPUB3 or HTML5. And all of the things that we're dealing with, even more so than we anticipated, are real preservation challenges. Here is our current workflow. We first get together and develop a list of publications with the publishers and work with those publishers to then define criteria for successful preservation. Then Clocks and Portico think about the best ways that they can sort of adapt their processes for these more complex works, and either develop a kind of mock-up to see what it would look like to preserve this work with their workflows, or actually go through the whole process and develop a real preserved work that they could potentially stand up without the publisher's activity. Then it goes, either that mock-up or the preserved work goes back to the publisher and the whole team to evaluate the success of what they've done. And again, we document what happened and create guidelines so that the broader community can learn from the experiments that we've conducted. Okay, so I'll briefly just say that my position straddles the libraries and NYU Press, and so we are in this project dealing with a couple of works from NYU Press. So I just wanted to mention very quickly NYU Press's digital monograph system. We have a site called Open Square. It is all of NYU Press's open access books. It is just an in-house platform, and we have a couple of enhanced ebooks on that site, which are the ones that are being run through this process. And Karen will talk about those a bit more. I was going to show you the platform, and maybe I'll just do that quickly, just so you have a sense of what the platform looks like. Here's the platform, and here's a book that has some video links in it. And you click on the book, and you can read this in the browser. This is an EPUB that's being read in the browser, and there are YouTube links in this book, which you can probably anticipate are a real preservation challenge. So I will hand it over to Charles, and after Charles speaks, Karen is going to talk about the ways that Portico has been dealing with EPUBs, enhanced EPUBs, which is mostly what NYU Press and Fulcrum have. After that, Susan will be talking about Manifold and the kind of works that they're producing, and Karen will again kind of lay out her thoughts and plans on how she might go about preserving Manifold works.
So Fulcrum is based at University of Michigan, and it's one of what are called by one of my colleagues the melon babies. So these were platforms started around 2014, 2015, and actually that's the origin of NYU's project, indirectly the origin of Manifold, the origin of Fulcrum. And I think what all of us were responding to was an observation that all our authors were becoming digital scholars. All our authors, because at the moment any scholar picks up a digital camera and starts taking photos in the archive, they're building a digital corpus. Some of them were progressing towards using digital tools. Some of them were very close to self-identifying as digital humanists. But everybody was working in digital spaces, and at the point of publication they were being forced to narrow down their presentation to fit between the virtual covers of a print facsimile ebook. And so what Melon was interested in and what we were interested in is how do we respond to the changing behavior of those authors. And we created our platform and pretentiously called it Fulcrum, because Manifold had been taken, and we set out 4 design principles, and those are the principles that we've stayed true to in building: flexible, durable, accessible, and discoverable. Durable was at the very first meeting that we had with our colleagues at NYU and Minnesota, the word that defined Fulcrum. And that is because it's built on institutional repository infrastructure. It's built on the Samvera Fedora framework. And it has been the major obstacle we've heard from authors who are concerned about moving into this digital space. They're concerned about the longevity of their work. So super important. It's a project based at Michigan, funded in its grant phase by the Mellon Foundation, although now we have our own funds flowing back from the sales of collections on Fulcrum. And we partner with lyricists to sell those collections. And one of our biggest collections now is the ACLS Humanities ebook collection, which has 800 library subscribers, around 70 publishers participating. And we've recently moved that on Fulcrum. So as we think about the types of work that we're seeing as publishers coming along the pike, the basic thing is still the standard ebook, and often the only innovation there is that it's open access, and that's an increasing feature, you know. So it's open access, maybe it has hypothesis annotation added, maybe it has a little bit of complexity, but it's essentially an ebook, and it's a standard ebook. Enhanced ebooks have the characteristic of having the ability to still be presented in a print format. So that's the crucial thing. You could still produce and sell a print version of these works. It would, however, not be as satisfying an experience as the ebook version, because there would be features within the ebook version that really enrich the argument. So this is a screenshot of a book called Animal Acts, and that's a book that we published a few years ago, and it's all about ways of representing the relationship between humans and animals in a kind of theatrical performance studies way. So in the print book, you can read about these, and that's great. You can see black and white pictures of snapshots, screenshots, but you really need to see the performance to really understand what the authors are saying. And that's what we're doing with the enhanced ebook. Technically, what we're having here is an EPUB reader, and so this is the architecture of Fulcrum, an EPUB reader based on a repository layer. So the reading layer is an EPUB3, it's an EPUB.js reader, which is like reading. It has an embedded player for the video called Able Player, and if you click on that video, you read it, you click, you then go to the repository layer, which is where this object is preserved, or at least managed. And there you can see it's an individual object. It's managed in a hierarchy repository. It has a lot of metadata. And then the crucial thing is it has these workflows. Yeah, so going down to other preservation services. What we're seeing coming further and further towards us, faster and faster, are these types of works, which are interactive scholarly works. The important thing here is this could not be reproduced in print. This is an archaeological report with a 3D model, with data, with multimedia. You couldn't represent this in a print form. It's got the same kind of architecture, an EPUB3 reader. It's serving up a 3D model, which is built in another software through WebGL, media resources, and everything is linked together, and that's the very difficult thing here. If you manipulate something in the 3D model, it will link to the text will link to the data will link to the 3D model, everything links and everything is interactive. And that is the scary thing that's coming towards us now. And that's me.
So I'm from Portico. If you've not heard of us, we're a community-supported digital preservation archive. We work with libraries and publishers to make sure that scholarly content is around for future scholars. And if something becomes no longer hosted online, then we can make it available through Portico instead. So you've already heard a bit about EPUBs, but I'm just going to tell you some little technical tidbits about it that make it play nicely in these viewers. Basically, if you unzip an EPUB, it looks like a little website inside with some configuration files. And as of EPUB 3, the thing that makes them a bit challenging to preserve is they're now allowed to put resources that aren't inside the EPUB, embed them visually or orally, and use them just as references. So in terms of ebooks in Portico, so far we've primarily received PDF and XML, and we've committed to preserving those into the future and making sure they're accessible. And we have about 100,000 EPUBs, but they've always come as secondary to these primary formats. So now that we are possibly receiving these as primary formats, we wanted to put a few things in place just to make them more preservable. So the first thing we did was build a new validation tool into the Jove tool, which is an open source project out of the Open Preservation Foundation. They manage it. So we've submitted this module to them and it will become a part of the future release. But what this does is make sure the file is what it says it is, and I try to identify structural problems that might cause problems with rendition down the road. We've also started to add an EPUB viewer into our access site so that if people have to access them this way, they can just open it in the browser rather than having to download it and find the right version of the viewer. Moving on, we've received these examples and they have these enhancements that are making them even more challenging to preserve. So I'm going to show you a few of the things we've come across and how we've been thinking about them. So the first one is these embedded YouTube videos, which are a problem. Typically, if we received an EPUB with a video, we kind of want the file as well, but if it's on YouTube, it might not be possible to provide it. So we have to figure out what to do with these. So we could just keep it as is, but that means when you view it later, it might look like this, where we can hold it, and we'd like to try and do something at least. But as Portico, we don't go out and capture the content we don't have permission to capture, and actually, technically, it's quite hard to capture videos from YouTube. So one thing we've been trying to do is look at the Internet Archive service for doing Save Page Now, where you can send them either as a human or automatically a URL. They will save it, and then they send you back a preserved link where you can access that material if it's gone. So we figured out that we can actually automate this. So we open up the EPUB and insert a little box underneath that tells you where you can get an archived copy of the content. So we think we can actually do this. So if you actually click on the link, you can go to the Wayback Machine and then see the video preserved. So there's some problems with Portico doing something like this. So first of all, by the time we preserve content, the video might already be gone, so it's too late. Also, it's not 100% a seamless process. Sometimes it doesn't quite capture right, or the HTML might be strange in the EPUB, and then the box might end up somewhere strange. And so for these reasons, ideally it would be a manual process where someone can quality check. And also, with those things in mind, we don't generally like to modify visually people's content that we're preserving, although EPUB is kind of challenging this stance a little bit. So for this, ideally, we'd like this sort of work to happen before it comes to us, but maybe as a last resort, we could do something. The other challenge we found with the Fulcrum content, and you saw this referenced, when we received the EPUBs and looked at them, inside they're actually embedding these little views into websites that are live on the Fulcrum platform. So we had to figure out what we're going to do with those. And here's another one where instead of putting the image directly in the EPUB file and displaying it, it's actually existing on the Fulcrum site, and it's visible through the EPUB as a live website. So when we received the preservation package for this, inside there was those EPUBs that I just described, and then all of the multimedia files that you see through those web views as separate files, and also some metadata, which gave us the mapping between the files that we had and their location in the EPUB. So we thought about what are our options for this. So the first thing we could do is just leave the whole thing as it is, and as a user experience, so the way Portico operates is this wouldn't be available unless Fulcrum didn't have this anymore. Inevitably, if we were to display this, it would look like this with a page not found sign. As a user, you'd have to kind of do some manual assembly and trying to figure out, reading files and metadata, and you need some technical ability to kind of put it back together. So we wondered if we could do a little bit better. So one thing we could do is use those instructions that are in the metadata, write some code, which would be a bit of startup time, and take out those views and replace them with the things we have. So use standard, embed code and put those things inside the EPUB. So it would start out with remote resources being outside of the EPUB, and then we could move them inside and do the necessary changes for them to be all in one big file. So it would look like this. So the problem is that would be probably an enormous file for some of these because they're quite multimedia rich, but that wouldn't work for distribution, but maybe it would work for archiving. So the idea would be if you're really motivated to find this in the archive, then you can download the whole file and all the intellectual content would be in one file. The other thing is you would lose the enhancements that are in those nice viewers that you saw, but maybe this is, I have about 4 variations of this approach, and if you want to hear them all, you're welcome to come talk to me, but I don't have time to cover them. Essentially, they all involve sort of stripping out that code and doing something else. So the third approach is, well, it's kind of behaving like a website, and especially with that last one that you saw, maybe we should be preserving it as a website. And so that would allow you to preserve those nice viewers and all of that. But the problem is now it's not an EPUB anymore, so if that's what you wanted, then dealing with a web archive file might be a bit more challenging. So I'm going to talk more about web archiving when I come back after we hear about Manifold, but I just want to make the point that I think each of these approaches brings something valuable, and the solution might be a combination of all of them. Obviously, that's the most expensive approach, so you might want to choose 2, or, but I think that would be probably the best thing. And just to mention that while we've been looking at them as EPUBs, our other preservation partner, Clocks, have been looking at them as a website as well. So maybe from our combined resources, we can find the best approaches. I'll hand it over to Susan.
Musical chairs up here, guys. So I'm Susan Dorr, I'm the Associate Director at the University of Minnesota Press, and we're one of those melon babies. We got some funding to produce open access, open source web publishing site for long-form scholarly monographs. Manifold has evolved a lot since then. Our partner on this is the City University of New York, the Digital Scholarship Lab at their Graduate Center. And their goal really was open textbooks and open educational resources. So we have evolved our thinking away from just long-form scholarly content to also include things like OERs and textbooks and other tools that scholars might want to use in the classroom. But for Minnesota, we work with a lot of digital humanists, and they wanted interactive and fancier projects than what we produce in print. So really what Manifold is about is stepping away from fixity and getting towards interaction and dynamic content. When it comes to preservation, just like Karen described, we can do a fixed version, and so we've chosen EPUB 3 as our export format for the fixed preservable format. So we'll take all the content out of a Manifold project and contain it within EPUB files, and that is one way that we can save it and preserve it for the long term. But one of the things that makes the Manifold project stand out is that you can do it as a work in progress, so it can contain drafts over a long time. So we have, and I'll show you an example in a few moments, we have examples of projects where the scholars are doing their research and writing publicly, and so they have draft chapters, and that has interaction with readers, and they have additional papers that aren't ever going to be part of the final publication, but they've contributed to the publication, and so they think that scholarly content has value. We want to preserve some of this material, but it doesn't really belong in the EPUB that would be called the book. It's something else. So is EPUB really the best way to preserve that, to represent it as it truly is? And that's something that we're working through with Karen. But another thing that we've learned is that we can reuse the metadata to provide context around the media and all of the text. The work we do for accessibility is also being repurposed for preservation, because all that metadata that we create for accessibility provides the context that would be needed for preservation down the road. But now I'll take you into a project. Can you help me get through? So what I'm going to show you is a project that the scholar is doing as a work in progress. Whitney has an NEH grant to produce this text. Do you want to make it bigger? Okay. So she has one draft chapter, which you can go into Manifold Reader and read today. And there's the media that she's collecting embedded right in the work. You can see at the bottom that she's designated that this is a draft chapter. And as readers, if they're logged in, they can annotate and comment. And one of the questions that we have for ourselves is, should we be preserving those comments and those annotations and that interactivity with the reader? From a technological perspective, this isn't a difficult problem to solve, but from a privacy policy perspective, it's a very difficult problem to solve. It probably comes back to whatever we decide is the term of service for use at Manifold and what we get our readers to agree to. But it's still something that we have to discuss what's best for A, the scholarly record, and B, for the reader. And that is one of the problems that we're working through with Manifold for all publishers who use it. I should note that right now we're on the University of Minnesota site for Manifold, but we have 32 institutions around the world that are using it to publish books. So the questions that we're answering for ourselves are things that others will follow in this model. We also assign a hashtag to a book, so then Whitney just tells you how to read her book. So we suck in here the tweets that are being made about this work. Should we be preserving these? Should this be part of the EPUB output that we would have? And then this gets updated as tweets happen in real time, as you can see the dates on those tweets. So is it better to preserve the site showing, the interactivity as it's represented here? And then the other thing about Manifold that's really great is it allows you to bring in these resource collections. So Whitney has about 125 different objects at archives around the world that go along with her project, and she's creating collections of these. Some of them, as you can see here, are links. As we move through this collection, I think this is a collection mostly of links. So right now you can't see it, you'd have to click on it, and then you'd have to go to the site of where that link exists. So if we preserve that, do we grab the object and put that in the EPUB that we output? Yep, okay, 1 minute. Or do we, she's got a lot of links, because these are all at the archives. Or do we just share the link, and then this is one of the Karen problems that needs to be solved. So now I'm going to pass it on to Karen to talk about how she's going to go about doing this.
Okay, so this part looks towards the future of what we're going to have to do, and I think by now you've probably noticed that some of these things aren't really going to work as EPUBs. So the solution is probably to try to preserve them as websites. And so we haven't done this work yet, but we've started to explore what kind of approaches we might take with these. And I'm going to just rush through the different approaches, and you can take a look at the flavor of them. So the first one would be to point a regular website harvester at it, one that automatically crawls the pages, which might work for simpler websites, but modern websites, they kind of do a lot while you're navigating a page, so you might hover over something and it's going back and getting information from the server. So a normal crawler can't sort of simulate those user interactions very well, although they're getting better, and it's just going to take some time for them to mature. So I pointed one at the Manifold website, and this was the result. It's because as soon as you load the page, it's trying to communicate again, and it's not. So all the way on the other extreme is this fantastic tool called Webrecorder, which you can download for free. And what you do is you open up your web page in it, you can navigate around your web page, and as you're doing it, it records it in a big web archive file. You have to click on every link, watch every video end to end, so the problem is it's very time consuming. So this is not something that Portico could do, but if a publisher wanted to spend this time, we could adjust our platform so it's ready to present this stuff. And this screenshot is just showing you could go so far in the playback as to change the font size, so it's the level of sort of detail that you can get. And by the way, if you look at Webrecorder's Twitter, yesterday I think they announced a new tool which could change all of this again, and I didn't have time to put it in, but it's fantastic. So is there something between these two extremes? So the answer is yes. In the last year, there's been these new tools that have emerged that do something in between, where if you have a very structured site that has a lot of the same kind of content, you can sort of automate certain actions. So you can tell it, go into the book, open the contents, click on each link there, hover over all the annotations, and you can configure it to do this. Sorry, and then it will go in and do that for every book. So so this is great. So at the moment, clocks are working with Webrecorder's autopilot tool, which does this. And we're going to be partnering with Los Alamos National Lab to try out Memento Tracer, which is a brand new tool. So if all else fails and it's not structured enough to automate things and the standard harvesters just aren't working, maybe we can preserve the whole website. And what would that look like? It would look like setting up the whole server side on an emulated server, and then on the same machine putting a browser where you could actually interact with the platform like it's live. So this is ambitious and exciting, and but we're going to try it and see if it's plausible to do as a preservation strategy. So emulation as a service infrastructure is a tool that's in development with Yale. They're part of our grant team, so they'll be helping us with this experiment. So in this case, what would a transfer of content look like? It would be a matter of transferring the live data from a live Manifold site into an emulated copy. And then you'd be able to browse the books as you would. And the nice thing about this is you don't have to keep maintaining the server because it's kind of encapsulated in this emulator. Just to bring it full circle, you can actually do this for EPUBs as well. So now that we have this validation module with Jove, we know what version of an EPUB it is, and we could, in principle, connect an emulator to the EPUB version so that you wouldn't have to download it and figure out what version of an EPUB you really need and all of this. It would just open in a browser in the right version and you'd be able to see it as it was. So that was the whirlwind tour around preserving websites. And I think we're done, and with that, we'll accept questions.
Yes.
Craig Van Dyke from Fox. Susan, you showed work in progress.
Yeah.
At a certain point, you will declare the work with an ISBN, right?
And a DOI.
And do you consider that a kind of landmark once the ISBN is assigned and the product is published, that becomes the preservable work? That would be one way to, well, then in that preservable work, does all that work in progress stuff still get presented to end users?
So the answer to that question is that what I didn't show you actually, because I showed you work in progress, is that we have a published designation that will appear on the project page next to a text when it is final. These works in progress have provisional approval by our faculty board. Their proposals were approved, but they aren't through peer review yet. So we will peer review and then publish these final works, and we'll assign an ISBN and a DOI, and we will name it as published. We will keep all this work in progress, but that won't be officially part of that peer-reviewed and published work. So that will always be contained in the Manifold project, but when we're talking about the official version of record, it will just be the resources and the final text. All that other apparatus that's legitimately part of the project will not, in our opinion, be part of that distilled version of record. That doesn't mean it's not worth preserving, because if you wanted to follow the progress of how this scholar worked and came to these conclusions, you'd want to see all that material. It would be worth keeping. But if we're talking about the version of record, it would not be part of that officially, in our opinion. Now, someone else could come through and decide to name it differently and say that we believe it should all be there. I'd be curious what you all think about that.
And I think there's, behind all of this, are questions, are business questions and questions of scale. How much do these things cost? And even if we do want to preserve the apparatus, can we do that in an efficient way? As to, there may be conversation or annotations in that apparatus that turn out to be as important to the scholarly discourse as the work of record. But that may not be a decision that's scalable to a publisher's works, generally speaking.
Or we might not have permission from those readers to preserve their discussion, even if we wanted to.
So I can mention another web archiving project that might be of interest in this. It's called Save Page Now from the Wayback Machine, which allows you to archive any page on demand. That's been around for a while. What just launched formally 2 weeks ago is that now it will follow all the links in that page
Yes.
and archive all of those, and will also work with PDFs. It will follow all the links in PDFs. So,
Yes, and seeing that announcement, I hadn't yet figured out the impact of that, on how, if it would make the capture better, or the same page now works quite well for this.
it does, and I've noticed two archiving things. A lot of times, Wayback will have 15 copies of the actual book announcement or the book page, but the underlying EPUBs, PDF, and other materials. I just did this over the weekend, I think with some NYU books, and they had 15 mentions of the book and of the page, 15 copies of that page, but the underlying EPUB and PDF were not in there. They also have a new tool, which is not publicly announced, but if you contact Mark Graham at Wayback, will allow you to drop hundreds of URLs into a Google Sheet, send it to Wayback, and they will crawl all of those at the same time.
All those links, we could preserve all of them.
Sure.
One observation I make about this is what's really interesting coming from within a library environment is how there are all these parallel initiatives working for special collections type materials. So we also deposit into AP Trust, for example, and then there's Chronopolis and things like that. And then there are tools happening in the technology sort of space, they're also working on this. And it's really interesting and challenging to see how to connect these initiatives, especially as the types of content are sort of merging, right? I mean, these are content types which combine narrative and data, and Portico and Clocks have been kind of primarily narrative sort of recording preservation services, and places like AP Trust have been primarily data type of recording places. But these combine those features. So how do we get those different communities to really share their expertise and work with us?
I'm Rebecca Chris from the Big Ten Academic Alliance. I have a ton of questions actually, but I'll limit it to two. One is that as you're talking about embedding data and 3D visualizations and things like that, you're starting to talk about a ton of memory.
Yeah.
And so where does this stuff live and how do you find that?
Is that preservation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes into, we charge for the service, and that would have to be a factor in how we evaluate, what the costs are going forward, so.
Yeah, I know the preservation librarians group in the Big Ten has talked about like how much can we afford to capture?
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And my other question is before the Big Ten, I was managing editor at University Press, and for those of you who are having this work in your workflow now, where does that live? Because getting authors to do it sounds.
Oh, no, they have to. They have to.
They do it.
Authors do a lot of the work. I don't know, for you too, Charles, yeah? We need them to be our partner in making the metadata that we need. They're the content experts. And it is a point of tension with us because when they don't produce quality metadata, then we need to intervene. And right now we have a digital projects editor around this project, thank you, Melon, who enhances what they provide to us. And so we have the this is good enough, and then, do we have time to make it better question with every project. And it isn't even that authors don't want to do it, it's a factor of time, and sometimes they just don't know how. And so we have to help them. And that's something we're learning, and we're sharing our learning with them.
And I think that's where the guidelines work that will be one of the outputs of this first phase is really important. And the analogy with accessibility is really interesting. As Susan said, I mean, the crossover between accessibility and preservation is very compelling. And also the paths that we're adopting. So in accessibility, you started off with things like the Diagram Center and describing visual resources, these kind of industry-wide best practices. And now we're pushing them into our author guidelines, versions of those. And I think we can see the same kind of transition for preservation, sort of national preservation, some good practice guides, which we can then import into our author guidelines.
And the other reason why that's important is because Susan and Charles really believe in this work, and so they can push their staff and their authors to really do this because they believe in it, and that doesn't happen everywhere. So the only way that we're going to get this, at a kind of industry-wide level is to have best practices and, ideally standards. So,
Michael Hunter, University of Winnipeg. So I just wanted to make a comment. This is really great to see looking forward because, I look after mainly the print collections and library, and even from shared print archive, initiatives and stuff like that, seeing, you get a print book, but it's, has a floppy disk or a CD in the back of it. Where was that preserved? Is that part of it that's missing? Well, again, you're missing a component that was published with the book, so where does that live? I know there's the Springer Extra site where you can find a lot of those extras, and they published an ebook that might have had some sort of component to it, but how that stuff is all preserved is really interesting. Back to the first question that was asked too. So I'm just wondering if, like business as usual, this is great, I think the model that you're creating, but I'm wondering if some of those things like saving comments and maybe more of the previous versions of the author's work before they published is more of an archival thing and of archival importance, like, author donating his or her papers to an archive. But that's not to say, again, there's these crossovers and making sure that things are set up so that an archivist or a digital curator can properly do that for the archives, even with things being handed off that way a little better.
So the question about are they creating archives? They're creating research archives, but as a university press, we have not considered it our mission or even our work to archive the research corpus around the book, and so we're getting into a squishy space for ourselves. I don't know where that's going to go. One of the thoughts I've had is, should we partner with the Scholars Institution? Does that archive belong at their university where that research is being done? And that's not a question I've discussed with anybody other than people within my own press, but it's a good question to begin asking. I'm not quite sure. We don't have enough capacity for that now, but it's a really valid one because those research archives might also lead to other work or work by other scholars. There's a lot there.
I think a really interesting distinction is between the project of research and the project of the publication. And one of the conversations that is the hardest to have with authors is, where does your research project leave off and where does your publication project start? The linking to other resources functionality that Manifold has and also Fulcrum has, I think is increasingly important when it comes to the archive of the research project. So we've had several cases where there's the research data repository has the research programs archive, and then the Fulcrum repository, which is on the same stack, has the publications enrichment archive, as it were. And then you have the publishing reader. And articulating how annotations fit, how these different bits fit, requires talking to the author about their research program versus their publication and how those link.
And I also think, Darcy, I'm going to call you out here. We've got Darcy Cullen from University of British Columbia Press, and she started a project called RavenSpace, and they're using Scalar as the foundation for their projects. So I think of Scalar. Fulcrum and Manifold both have very linear narratives, and then we bring in all this media. But Scalar enables you to build if you will, a choose-your-own-adventure sort of book, because you can follow different pathways through the book, and you double back and go forward again. So these aren't linear narratives, and so that creates yet an even different preservation challenge than what Charles and I are facing with our projects. And there are even more of these projects proliferating. Stanford University Press are building what are essentially websites for each book that they're creating. So these are really important and deep, valid scholarship that needs to be preserved. And so I'm really glad that this project is happening and we're addressing these questions.
We're a few minutes over, but thank you very much for coming.